Hello, gang. It's me, Tattooed Biker, here with you. And first of all, thank you for clicking on this compilation. It really helps out the channel. And it's over 2.5 hours of nothing but my favorite real stories from the last year. Reports and experiences from real viewers just like you. These emails detail sightings of ghosts and the paranormal, Bigfoot, Dogman, and some cryptids and creatures that don't quite fit the usual mold. So enjoy the video. Its stories are presented without numbers, only this one intro, and it will stay without the interruption of mid-roll ads. So it's perfect to wind down with or just let it run in the background for a long car ride or doing things around the house. Anyway, enough of my blathering. Grab your gear and let's ride.
Dear Biker, so let me start out by saying that I enjoy writing, so this will be quite long. It is nonfiction though, but will hopefully be an interesting read. I also admit that I have absolutely no memory of this experience. I was a little over 2 years old, and just starting to walk on my own when this event took place. My mom only told me this story around 3 years ago, when I was 32 and about to get married. Now, my mom was raised in a very tiny, fundamentalist Christian community, and had no belief in the paranormal whatsoever. She believed that our souls sleep until Judgment Day or something like that. Ergo, there are no ghosts or spirits that haunt houses. Even over 30 years later, she still sounded terrified as she told me this story. This woman, who always talks way too loud, was literally whispering by the end of it, and she was white as a sheet. I believed her completely and still do. My mom never talks about stuff like this, and I'm just glad that I can't remember it. In 1988, my parents had their second child. This was my brother Victor. We were very crowded in our rented flat with 2 babies, and my parents decided to move into a rambling old 2-story farmhouse on a 7-acre plot in southern Ohio for more room for the family. It was way out in the sticks and took almost an hour to get to town from there. My mom said that the first time I saw the house, I freaked out. I was crying and saying things like, "Don't like the mean house, don't like. Scary house, Mama, don't like." My mom says that this behavior was very out of character for me, but I stopped complaining about the house after a few weeks, so she just chalked it up to the stress of the move. Now, this house was ramshackle and in the middle of nowhere. The kitchen was at the far rear of the house, and until recently, before we moved in, still had an ancient wood-burning cooking stove against the back wall. This had caught the back wall on fire a few months before we moved in, and it caused a lot of damage. A lot of this damage wasn't fixed yet, so my young, broke parents got a very cheap rent agreement. Gotta love the 1980s. On the second floor, directly above the kitchen, was a locked room. The landlord claimed that it had heavy fire damage, but her son, who had done the repairs, claimed the only fire damage was in the kitchen since it had the worst and was beyond his skill level to fix. Either way, the landlord was adamant that the room was off limits, and my parents always respected that. I know all this because I heard stories about the crappy farmhouse with the creepy door my whole life, and there were pictures of us in and around that farmhouse. The locked door was right next to the upstairs landing, so there was no avoiding it, and both my parents have told me that it gave them the creeps. A few months after we moved in, my mom and I were in the yard with our pit Doberman mix, Boss. She was hanging laundry, and I was rolling around with the dog. She said that just as she noticed that everything was way too quiet, Boss started going crazy from surprisingly far away. About 500 yards from the house and down on the left, there was a small duck pond, and Boss was in between the two, running towards my mom, and then turning and running back towards the pond, barking frantically the whole time. That's when my mom saw something thrashing around in the middle of the pond. She took off towards the water full speed. Boss beat her there and dragged me out of the water himself. Thank you, Pupper. Although my mom was confused how I got so far so fast, and how I got into the center of the pond since it was over my head and I couldn't swim. She figured that she underestimated me and brought in the baby gates and playpens. I was to be contained from that point forward. Well, a few weeks later, she was cooking downstairs and Boss was outside, Victor asleep in his crib, and I was in my playpen in my room upstairs. I also had a gate on my door and one at the top of the stairs. The stairs ran up from the side of the kitchen, so my mom said she could listen for us crying or fussing while she cooked. My mom said no longer than 15 minutes after the last time she looked in on us kids, Boss starts going crazy again out in the yard. She runs up to check on us. Victor's still sleeping. Every baby gate is still shut and locked, but I'm not in my room. A frenzied search reveals that I'm not in the house at all. A sudden image of Boss saving me from drowning caused my mom to rush outside to see what he's trying to tell her this time. She said that he was running circles around the yard, barking uncontrollably. When she gets outside, he took off towards the right, away from the pond. He would run ahead, turn around, and then bark at my mother, waiting for her to catch up a little before racing off again. He ended up leading her almost a mile and a half out onto the dirt road that separated our property from our neighbors. He led her to a thick stand of trees on our neighbor's side of a rocky drive. She said that what hit her first was the foul stench of advanced decay. She plowed into those trees with her heart in her throat and her stomach full of ice. She said that she noticed many piles of corrugated tin, tarps, tires, and other debris. The smell was coming strongly from these junkyard items. Peeking under a sheet of tin, she discovered the extremely decomposed corpse of a butchered cow. As she headed deeper into the thicket, where the tree cover was denser, she said less care was taken to cover the remains. Grisly pieces of bones and rotting chunks of bovine littered the area. Apparently, our neighbor, in an effort to cheat his taxes, had been illegally slaughtering cattle and then hiding the remains in the thicket of trees. She found me in the dead center of this thicket, just standing there, looking around like I was confused, surrounded by all this carnage. She said that I didn't seem scared or anything, just standing there. She rushed over to me, and after ascertaining that I wasn't injured, she began questioning me on why I was there, how I got there. Now keep in mind that although my mom said that I started speaking very young, I still didn't have much of a vocabulary. She said that I told her, with that serious look that only small children can give, that the children brought me here. Shitting her pants at the thought that anyone, even children, could walk right past her through the kitchen, get me from upstairs, and then walk right back past her on the way down those stairs, and then out with me. She demanded to know what children and where the hell they are now. I looked at her, dead serious, and told her that the ones that live with us in the room at the top of the stairs, and that I didn't see them anymore. After a moment of stunned silence, she starts asking all kinds of questions about these children. However, she told me that I refused to say anything else. She said as long as she questioned me about what happened, I would just stand there staring at her with a serious expression and my mouth closed. She said this same pattern held true every time that she brought it up to me, so she was always left wondering and immediately began hounding my dad about moving closer to town. Now, while the incident with me getting to the pond was highly unlikely, it was at least remotely possible. Now, from my mom's point of view, she's adamant that me being out there that day was completely impossible. She says there's no way I could have even known it was out there, much less have the ability to open and relock the baby gates, get downstairs past her, and end up almost 2 miles down the road in this place in under 15 minutes. I was only 2 and as slow and clumsy as most toddlers are. As I said, she's still shaken up by it, even after 30 years. Personally, I have no idea what happened that day. I've thought about hypnosis, but haven't yet decided if I really want to remember. Maybe it's just better to let it be a mystery. Because whatever those things were, I really don't think they were children. Signed, Bobby. Hey TB, I have a story to tell. You see, I was a sergeant in the U.S. Army and ETSing, or getting out from the military, when President Bush ordered more troops into Iraq back in 2003. I had just returned home to Austin, Texas, when I was summoned up into my local National Guard unit at Camp Mabry and told that I was being recalled to the Army, but the unit was already tasked out to deploy to Iraq. I wasn't part of their unit yet, so the commander offered to give me a waiver to deploy with a government contractor, Halliburton. I knew that I would make more money as a contractor, so I eagerly took the offer. Not long after arriving in Kuwait at Camp Doha, I began working with the operations team there, overseeing logistics and affairs. We would oversee the daily convoy of supply between Kuwait and Baghdad, a route riddled with IED incidents, small arms skirmishes, and almost constant breakdowns of Army and civilian vehicles. Because I was a saw gunner in the 1st Infantry Division while I was active duty, and technically still was in the Guard, I was often in the convoys, manning a mounted weapon that accompanied mostly civilian convoys. During these runs, as we called them, we had a few strange encounters in an area south of Baghdad, known then as Camp Babylon. Occupied by French troops, but then designated as an archaeological site for obvious reasons, Camp Babylon was set up in the area that was said to originally be inhabited by the famous Tower of Babel. Indeed, there were ruins there that did look like a massive structure and once stood at that spot. I had 2 strange incidents happen to me while I was passing through there. The first incident seems a bit benign now, but it sets the mood for the second. We were passing through Camp Babylon in the afternoon one day, when our convoy took small arms fire. The SOP at the time was to stop the convoy and then return fire. This was because in the past, such incidents ended up being a lone gunman attempting to scare the convoy into running into IEDs on the road. Because of this, the SOP changed to stop the convoy, dismount, and then return fire. While engineers looked for explosive devices along the road, we all scanned the horizon for the enemy. Nothing. They most likely fled immediately. However, the ruins around Camp Babylon were alive with shadow figures that seemed to dart around the area. Several times we would spot them, but they would immediately disappear. A contractor, lying beside me with his weapon, commented, "How odd that we're in the shadow of Babel and fighting the supernatural." I didn't respond, but I knew that he was a 32nd degree Mason who was really into the arcane aspects of Babylon. And I didn't feel at the time that very much was supernatural, but I certainly did see the shadowy figures darting around the structures. Once the road was deemed clear, then we continued on our way to Baghdad. The second incident occurred about a month later. At this point, the weather in southern Iraq and Kuwait had turned quite cold at night. During this encounter, we had just completed a supply run to Baghdad and were returning back to Camp Doha in Kuwait when a vehicle in our convoy broke down. Once again, we found ourselves right at Camp Babylon. While the Army mechanics took a look at the vehicle, the rest of us took up fighting positions around the area, and that's when strange things began to occur. It started with a strange light bobbing in the desert. Thinking it was a person with a flashlight, we used our night vision goggles to watch. It was simply a glowing ball of light moving towards a set of ruins. After initial contact with the light, a few of us had moved forward away from the convoy to try and see what the source was. After seeing that it was self-contained and not a person, we were quite a bit alarmed. Then we heard a sound that I'll never forget. A long wailing began from one of the ruined structures not too far away. It sounded like a woman in agony, mixed with intense loneliness. On and on the sounds went on while we huddled in the cold and the dark, wondering what the hell we were listening to. With our NVGs equipped, we used our flashlights to spotlight the ruins. If you've ever done this, you'll know what a normal flashlight with NVGs looks like a massive beam of light. We scoured the whole area, but found no source for the whales or the ball of light. Around this time, we were told via radio that the vehicle was repaired and ready to roll, so we decided to return to the convoy. I was just slinging my saw over my shoulder when I noticed my contractor partner was staring at the ruins in horror. He was frozen. I shook him, and he snapped out of his stupor, quickly leaving the area with the rest of us. Once we were back at the camp, and it was pleasantly daylight the following morning. A group of us were sitting around chatting about the encounter the previous night, before our daily operations briefing. It was then that I remembered the terrified expression on the face of the contractor. I took the opportunity to ask him about it. He was still obviously traumatized by the event, but managed to explain that as we were leaving our position on that sandy hill, he sees a tall, black figure standing beside the ruins. It was just standing there watching us as we were looking for him. He said that he felt an instant wave of despair hit him, and he thought in that moment that he was going to die. He didn't remember even leaving the area. His very next memory was in the Humvee, headed back to Kuwait. I'll never forget the wailing figure at the ruins of Babel. It's also worth noting that when I related this story to some of our Pakistani employees at Camp Doha and Camp Arafan, they were also quite horrified. One of them, a translator we called Artie, said that we had encountered a jinn, or a damned spirit, and that we were very lucky to have lived to tell the tale. Looking back, I have to agree. Signed, Daniel. Dear Tattooed, back in the early 80s, I lived in Okinawa, Japan. My dad thought that seeing the world would be an adventure that would help my brother and I become better men, and I have to say, I think he was right. Being in the military showed me cultures that many would never get to experience, and I'm thankful for every experience that life gave to me, even the scary ones. While we lived in Japan, my father wanted us to have a fully immersive experience, so he chose to move us into a small Japanese neighborhood off base. We lived in a little house at the top of an enormous hill, in a cul-de-sac that overlooked, I kid you not, part of a huge zoo, and on one side a fairly large cemetery. Our particular house was set far above the monkey habitats, about a mile downhill. Between us and those habitats was nothing but thick, Indiana Jones-style jungle. Jungle the neighborhood kids and I would tromp through endlessly, ignoring the local warnings about poisonous snakes and ancient untripped mines from World War II. We were the only American family living in that cul-de-sac, completely surrounded by Japanese families. And truly, it was amazing. The kids loved us, and although we couldn't communicate through language very well, we managed to get along perfectly. Opposite us was an older couple with a lush garden surrounding the property. The older woman wanted us to call her Mama-san, and she had us helping her garden whenever she could coax us over with green tea and chocolate banana cookies. We loved her. She was so welcoming and generous, as was everyone else actually. We lived in a wonderful neighborhood. The only drawback to Mama-san's home, however, was that she directly overlooked the cemetery, and that cemetery was unlike any one that I'd ever seen before. Because Okinawa is an island, burials didn't happen very often. Instead, above-ground crypts are built, many of them built into the sides of the hills that make up the island itself. The crypts are large, made of huge arcs of polished stone, set over a large square of that stone, which has a square insert cut into the middle of it for the coffin to be placed inside. Once inside the square is inset with another piece of polished stone, leaving a kind of shelf on the outside, so offerings can be made to lost loved ones. Yen, food, flowers, and incense are some of the offerings that are given. Below Mama-san's house was a valley that swooped back up onto another hill opposite her home. That valley and both hills were covered with these crypts and spider webbing. Up and down through the crypts were various stone-step pathways that were old and badly maintained. It was quite a sight. One evening, Mama-san asked me to come visit with her alone. She had something to show me, but it was only for me, as the older brother. Intrigued and a bit proud, I readily agreed. She took me to the back of her garden and sat me on a thick wooden bench that was carved with scenes of fishermen and men with swords, and told me that she had a story to tell. Mama-san then disappeared for a few minutes, and soon returned with a tray that held hot green tea and sweet rice cakes. Sitting next to me, she smiled and commented on the colors of the evening sky as the sun began to lower. Mama-san said that she had seen me, my brother, and some other kids daring each other to follow a stairway path down into the cemetery. You have to understand, the path from our little home area down to the cemetery consisted of hundreds of steps, many broken or cracking, in and out of bushes, and at a steep incline. It would be dangerous for anyone, but the real test was seeing how long we could take the walking through the crypts at night. Mama-san wanted to explain why that was a bad idea. You see, many years ago, during the war, Americans were thought to be devils, monsters that would murder innocent children for no reason other than to kill. That fear was the product of wartime propaganda used to encourage young men in the military service and farmers to fight alongside them. But many didn't. Many ran. And with nowhere to go and nowhere to hide, hundreds of Japanese citizens hurled themselves off a cliffside rather than face torture at the hands of their perceived enemy. I was terrified at just hearing this. I had no idea this had happened. I was mortified and hit with such sadness that I started to cry. The sun was setting, and the sky went from pink and blue to a deep orange and red. Mama-san reached out and held my hand, telling me not to worry, that this was the past, and the past is something we must always remember so we'd ever go back. Then she went on with her story. One young woman had followed through this sacrifice with her 2 children, but she survived the fall. She was in a coma for months, and when she did regain consciousness, she was horrified to realize that she wasn't with her children. They had been buried somewhere in that cemetery below, in an unmarked crypt that held many others. The woman would spend days and nights searching the cemetery, crying in pain, the torment of her loss unbearable, until the day she threw herself into the ocean to hopefully be reunited with her lost family. But they say that she never did find her children. Her act of suicide doomed her to purgatory, and she would remain tortured for all eternity. By now the sun had disappeared, and the cemetery drowned in inky blackness, the main path dotted with dim, broken lights, feebly illuminating small areas. Mama-san continued. She still wanders that cemetery, she said, looking for her kids, and if you listen, you can hear her crying. And then she pointed down. I really didn't want to look, but I did. I looked. And there, in the back of the cemetery, in the darkness, was a white figure. At first, a bright white shimmer, moving slowly, kind of shaking. It moved from side to side like it was moving among the crypts, and you could actually hear the crying. Softly at first, but then low moans and whimpers of pain as it got closer. I was completely terrified, and I wanted to run, but Mama-san held my hand and whispered that she wouldn't come up here. We were too far away, but that is why we shouldn't go down there after dark. She said many don't know her story and call her the White Witch, which angers her. It's best to just stay away. It's best to stay away and pray for her. Mama-san said she comes out to see her often, hoping one day she'll find her salvation. Needless to say, I never went down to that cemetery, not once, and I never sat back there with Mama-san again either. That once was enough for me. I did, however, visit Suicide Hill. It's called Peace Prayer Park now, out of respect. I cried the whole time we were there, and I prayed for all the souls and for forgiveness. So many Japanese citizens spoke to us, welcoming us, telling us stories and sharing with us. I didn't feel worthy, and my love for the country and its people was overwhelming. I'll never forget my time there. Someday I'd like to go back, just to see if she's still there, wandering the graves looking for her children. Thanks for taking the time to read this, biker. Signed, Brian. Dear Biker, when I was younger, my family went camping a lot. We used to go into the Uinta Mountains in Utah most of the time. There was a lake that we would camp next to, so, of course, my family would be fishing. My dad, my mom, my uncle, and I were on the shore trying to catch fish. Across the shore, on the other side of the small lake, my dad noticed a huge, black-haired figure, just standing still and looking right at us. This thing had to have been at least 8 feet tall, maybe even taller since it was so far away. My dad tried yelling at it, since he had thought it was a prank of some sort. I don't remember exactly what he said, but I remember the sound that the creature made back. It wasn't anything that we understood, just a kind of unintelligible screeching. It did, however, sound like it knew what my dad was saying, and like it was saying something to us, only in its own language. We were all looking at it at that point. My grandparents and my brother had joined us, and I remember my parents attempted to recreate the screeches that it was making, and it would respond. This went on for a few minutes. Then the creature just took off, and I mean quick and fast, on hands and feet. The entire time before it had been on 2 feet like a human. It turned and started running towards the forest and was out of sight in seconds. It had to have been going like 25 to 30 miles per hour. My brother, grandpa, and dog tried chasing it and went to where we had seen it and in the direction it had left. They did find a huge lump of black hair that was stuck in a barbed wire fence, although I'm not certain it was really from the creature. Why we didn't leave still puzzles me. We spent the night in tents, and it was very windy, and I don't think anyone actually slept. I was worried that this thing might come around our campsite, and I'm not sure the rest of my family was concerned. I think about it from time to time still, but honestly, it isn't that rare of an encounter in Utah. I've seen UFOs. My brother was followed by a UFO, and I lived near Skinwalker Ranch my whole life. Because of our native Ute tradition, I believe that many of my people take encounters like these in stride. Thanks for reading. Signed, Brian. Hey TB, my encounter happened on the second Saturday of November 2010 in Central Texas. I worked late Friday, which put me waking up Saturday much later than planned. So I decided on a late day hunt, and I figured I'd go out around 3 p.m. and sit in the pop-up ground blind until dark. I got there just before 3, got ready and headed out. By that time, it was about 10 minutes after. As soon as I hit the woods, I smelled this horrible odor. I was still a good 75 yards from the blind, but the smell was of death and even worse. I've never smelled anything like it before. It was as if a dead animal had been out in the sun for quite a while, but there was also a mixture of other odors. I stopped and looked around for the dead animal, but saw nothing, so I continued on my way. There's this game trail that breaks off onto another trail. It would bring you to the back of the blind, and I never took that way. I always went through the woods to a fence line, and then turned left and then just followed the fence out to the blind. I finally got to the fence line, and the smell was a bit stronger, so I stopped to look around for the dead animal again. But again, there was nothing. So I turned left and started off towards the blind. I was probably 50 yards from the blind, and I could see someone at the blind. I flipped my rifle safety off and kept going. As I got closer, I thought to myself, well, it's not Dad, it's another hunter. As I got a little closer, I could tell his head was in the pop-up blind window. And I thought that was strange, as a hunter would be in a ghillie suit. As I got nearer, the hunter looked like someone dressed in a Bigfoot suit. Thinking that's a good way to get shot. 30 or 40 yards out, that horrible odor hit me again, square in the face. At the same time, its head popped out of the blind window, and we looked eye to eye at each other for what seemed like forever, although I'm sure it was just a matter of seconds. There were no trees or brush between us, a clear view. I literally froze. I didn't move at all as it stomped the ground and grunted at me. All I could do was stand frozen in place in my fear. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. It stepped out of the blind and walked away from me, down the fence line, and then pushed the fence down as it stepped over. It looked back at me while it walked across the field, and I watched as it reached another fence, which it easily stepped over. It reached the edge of the far woods and then disappeared from my sight. I got a clear look at it from head to toe. Face, muscles moving under the fur, the whole 9 yards. It looked quite human in the face, although a bit Neanderthal-like. The reddish color resembled that of an orangutan, with a Caucasian skin tone. It had to have been 8 to 10 feet tall and was jacked with muscle. I mean, like a bodybuilder's tone. There was no mistaking it for a female. I've included a sketch to show the size comparison. I'm about 5'9" or 5'10", and so it's safe to say that my hunting days are over. Signed, Sully. Hey, Tattooed Biker. I have something I'd like to share. You see, I grew up in southeast Texas, about 40 miles west of Houston, and lived on a small farm. Sometimes at night, there would be something screaming out in the fields from time to time. My neighbors heard it as well. One morning, while waiting for the school bus at the end of our driveway, I looked down and noticed a very large, bare footprint in the sand. The heel had been run over by my dad going to work, but the rest of it was plain as day. About 12 inches long and at least 7 inches wide was still exposed that you could see. I knew that it was a Sasquatch print. I wanted to show someone, but here comes the bus, and I had no time to run back home and get my brother to take a look. That afternoon, when I got off the bus to see the track again, so many cars had gone in and out of the driveway that day that it was now completely gone. I sure was disappointed about that. I tried to tell my brothers and a few friends about it, but I don't think they really believed me. There was a neighbor in the 1970s who lived on the property directly north of ours. He went deer hunting, shot one, and then took it home. He tied up the deer to field dress it, hanging it from a tree limb. His wife called him in for breakfast, and after he came out to field dress the deer, he looked and saw the deer that he had tied up wasn't there. He noticed it being dragged over a fence and into the woods, but he never saw what had it. Everyone said it was a big cat that got it, but looking back now, I know that big cats pick up their prey with their teeth and walk forward. This deer was being dragged. Cats don't drag anything backwards. And how would a cougar be able to pull the deer down from the rope that it was tied up with? It was like this cat that got the man's deer. The big cat would have been the last thing he saw going over the fence and into the woods, not the deer itself. Anyway, I was talking recently to a friend of mine who grew up next door to me. He's in his 50s now, and I'm in my mid-40s. He told me that he went fishing in the 90s on the lake that was on the property where the man had his deer drug off. He said while he was walking up to the lake in the woods that he saw trees that had had the bark stripped off them, about 9 feet up off the ground, and it looked like there were claw marks in the bare wood beneath. While he was fishing there that day, he began to get the feeling that he was being watched. That made him really nervous, but then he noticed a very strong, musky odor that he had never smelled before. And then he got the heck out of there, fast. He said that when he goes to visit his parents' place, he can still smell that smell from time to time in the air. He also said that he and his brothers would hear whistling and whoops on their property, but never saw what was making that noise. He said that they also heard stuff walking on 2 feet on their property at night, but never saw anything then either. Another incident, in the exact same area back in the 60s, where some guys went swimming at their lake one evening. It was about a half mile from my home. The 2 brothers and a couple of friends were swimming. Their car horns started blowing. There were no houses close by, and they thought that my uncle had gone over there messing with them. They kind of got spooked because they couldn't see their car since it had become dark. So they got out of the lake and grabbed their flashlights, running over to where their car was parked. They told me there were very strange footprints in the sand all around their car. Then they knew it wasn't my uncle messing with them because the prints were huge and barefoot, and it had to have been an extremely large person to have left them. But nothing was ever said about a Sasquatch. They just thought it was some huge man without shoes on. One more thing that happened to my older brother and cousin makes me think that it's been a Sasquatch the whole time. You see, my mother had a twin sister, and they were always out doing stuff together. So one evening, there was a special at church, and my parents and my aunt and uncle went to it. My older brother and cousin stayed at my aunt's house, while the grown-ups were all at church. Long story short, my aunt and uncle had a cattle farm, and they had dogs that were kind of mean per se, but really just didn't take a like to people much. They always stayed outside. Now, my aunt's place was about 200 acres. Anyway, it was a really large place, and while my brother and cousin were there just watching TV or whatever, the dogs started whining outside. Now, they had 7 or 8 of them. And these dogs, they never came inside of the house, but suddenly they were scratching at the door, wanting in. Then they heard what sounded like something scraping the window screen in the living room. This was summertime, and the windows were open. That scared my cousin and brother enough to lock themselves in the bathroom until our parents all came back from church a few hours later. My brother said that he was in the 10th grade at the time, and my cousin would have been in the 7th. My brother said it sounded just like something was scraping its fingernails on the window screens. It would do it at one window for a bit, and then go to the next window. He said that whatever it was went around to all windows of that house and scratched on all the screens. I thought about these things on and off that had happened to my brother, neighbors, and cousins a lot down through the years. And after putting 2 and 2 together, and some things that I've experienced as an adult, I look back at those weird events, and I now believe that it was a Sasquatch that had done these things that took place. Signed, Gene. Dear Biker, back when I lived in northwest Oklahoma City, I would frequently take evening walks at the Stitchcomb Wildlife Refuge. The preserve is roughly 1,000 acres, located on the suburbs of Oklahoma City and adjacent to the Wiley Post Airport. Beginning from the parking lot at the end of Northwest 50th Street, the maintenance road will take you 2.5 miles upriver to the Kilpatrick Bridge, where the North Canadian River enters the preserve. However, the city only maintains the trail to the remote communication building, and from there, the trail becomes overgrown in the summers. The park is typically visited by local neighbors, bicyclists, horseback riders, and dog lovers. That particular evening, I decided to venture past the communication building. I continued another half mile up the path to where the power lines cross the river. From there, the riverbank drops about 15 feet, giving a nice view of the river below. As I approached the area, my eyes immediately caught someone down at the river's edge. What I saw was an all-black figure down at the river about 250 feet away. I thought it was strange because not many people hike off trail into the preserve during the summers this late in the evening, or even past the communication building. As I watched this man down at the riverbank, I started to notice subtle details, like golden red hair in the sunset. I also didn't notice any distinct clothing, but just hair alone. At this moment, I remember being really confused as to what I was seeing. Whoever was down at the river began to walk inland, using its arms to move the reed bushes. And that's when I saw the long hair dangling from its arm, shoulder to hand. Oh my God, it's Bigfoot, I thought. I immediately began to reach for my phone without taking my eyes off the creature. And that's when it noticed me. What terrified me the most was I wasn't able to make out any detail on its face. It's like my brain just couldn't process it all of a sudden as we made eye contact. And that's when this sheer feeling of terror suddenly overtook me and I just ran. I continued running until I met a couple with their dog back at the communication building. I'll never forget the look of confusion on their faces when I came sprinting around the corner. I wanted to stop and tell them about my experience, but for some reason I couldn't will my panic away long enough to even stop, and so I continued to run. The following day I returned to look for footprints, but was unable to venture into the reeds. Weirdly enough, the experience wasn't enough to scare me away completely. It's like after a bit that feeling of sheer terror slowly faded, and instead I was more cautious of the time and day and surroundings. I continued to exercise at Stitchcomb until I moved to Arizona in July of 2019. Thanks for reading. Signed, Richard. Dear Tattooed Biker, I'd like to share a Bigfoot encounter with you that I, along with my brother and sister, had back in 2022. Now about me. I'm a doctor, and I'm not prone to wild bouts of imagination. And I can safely say that before this encounter, I didn't believe in Bigfoot nor in any cryptids or the paranormal. Well, anyways, it was August 2nd, and my brother, sister, and I were visiting the lighthouse at South Carolina's Hunting Island State Park. It was around noon when we were leaving the lighthouse parking lot and driving along the exit road from the lighthouse. My brother was driving, with me riding shotgun and my sister in the rear driver's side seat. As we rounded a slight curve, we spotted this creature walking quickly on the left side of the road, maybe only 15 to 20 feet in front of the car. It all happened pretty fast as this thing disappeared into the lush palmetto and pine forest that surrounds that road. My brother immediately jammed on the brakes, bringing the car to an abrupt halt, and asked if we had seen what he saw. All three of us agreed on seeing this thing. In fact, we all saw it very clearly as it was walking directly in front of the car. The three of us just sat and chatted and realized that we had all seen exactly the same details. This creature was walking upright, taking these long, almost casual-looking strides, but was somehow covering ground extremely quickly before disappearing into the bush on the left side of the road. We got the best look at the lower torso of the creature, as its head and shoulders were somewhat obscured behind an overhanging branches and leaves. The height of the creature wasn't huge. Like I would have expected, it looked to be about 5 to 6 feet tall. Legs were approximately 3 feet long with human-like jointed knees. It was covered in dark brown or splatchy black hair that was approximately 2 inches long. The entire incident only lasted a few seconds, as the thing disappeared quickly into the thick underbrush. There were no sounds or odors noticed by any of us. We all just sat there in a state of amazement as to what had just occurred, and because it had all happened so quickly. We've enjoyed taking many vacations in that park through the years since we were children, back from the 1950s to the present. Now, although that area is abundant in wildlife, we've never witnessed anything like this in the past. The three of us reported the incident to the Hunting Island State Park office the next day, and the park superintendent called me a short time later, and I provided him with a full description and details of the incident. He informed me that he would take the report as a credible incident and initiate an investigation. And a few days after the incident, I reported the sighting on the BFRO website, and they also called me back about a week later and asked a few follow-up questions, but I didn't really have any more to add than I shared here. I have included some coordinates and GPS location pictures of the exact spot that it took place. I also included a photo of myself and my siblings that we took that day, but please don't show our faces. Thanks for reading. Signed, Bob. Hey, Tattooed. I had a strange incident that happened in August of 2006 that continues to bother me because I have no explanation for it. I was living in Elkins, West Virginia at the time with my wife's parents. I used to go into the Dolly Sods Wilderness area a lot to go hiking and to just spend some alone time. I had heard stories about the Dolly Soda and that Bigfoot was in there. I never paid much attention to the stories. One late afternoon, I was in the low part of the Dolly Sods at the Red Creek. This area is really beautiful, but you can wander off the trail and easily get lost. It had started to rain, so I was heading back towards my truck. On my way, I noticed something big move out of some thicket about 50 yards to my left. I stopped to get a better look with my binoculars. I waited until I saw more movement and then aimed the binoculars in that direction. What I saw actually caused me to gasp. I could see it very clearly. It was a monstrous creature, standing at least 7 feet tall, and had black hair all over. It was walking on 2 very strong legs that looked human. It had a very large chest, and the arms and hands were huge, and even bigger than those of a very powerful man. I couldn't see the fingers because it was carrying some sort of vegetation. The head was huge and covered in thick hair, but its face had an odd-looking form. It was hard to make out since it was moving away from me, but the jawline extended out from the rest of the face. It continued to walk swiftly away from me, but in the same direction where the truck was parked. I didn't know what to do, and so I kind of stood frozen for several minutes. I started to quietly walk toward the truck when I hear something crashing through the thicket. I stopped and knelt down, but I couldn't see anything. Well, by then I'd had enough and I wanted to get out of there. I started running towards the truck and made it there in about 10 minutes. I quickly drove away and went straight home. I never went back to the Dolly Sods. I'm now very wary of all things in the wilderness. I contacted a couple of wildlife experts who probably thought I was crazy. I'd never believed it if I hadn't seen it myself. One of these guys did say that there had been a wolfman reported in the area back in the 1870s and that he had personally talked to a few people who had claimed to see Bigfoot. To me, this wasn't a Bigfoot in my mind. Not long after that incident, we moved to Morgantown, West Virginia. I still enjoy hiking, but now I prefer to stay on the more pedestrian trails. Any idea what this could have been? Signed, Rick. Hello, sir. My name is Dee, and I'd like to confide in you an experience I had in 1990 when I lived near Cooperstown, New York. It was mid-spring, and a girlfriend and I had decided to take a walk in the surrounding countryside. While we were taking a rest near a large outcropping of rocks, there was this humming sound coming from one of the nooks. My girlfriend stood and started walking towards the noise. Though it was late afternoon and we were in heavy tree cover, there was enough light to see into the rocks. As she got closer, she said that the sound was coming from inside one of the large boulders. I began to walk towards her and the boulder to have a listen for myself. We stood there for about 5 minutes, and that's when we noticed that the boulder seemed to start shimmering like water. We quickly stepped back as the shimmer grew and changed to a greenish hue. Then suddenly, 2 small beings emerged from the shimmering portal. These beings walked towards us as we tried to move away, but it's like we were paralyzed and unable to walk. These beings, they were about 3 feet in height and had green-colored clothes that looked like work overalls. The faces and body features were human-like, though I'd have to say more human children, but with some adult features. They also had long blonde hair and very dark, large, round eyes. Their hands had 4 distinct fingers and were very rough textured. This incident occurred much earlier in the film, but these beings reminded me of the hobbits in The Lord of the Rings. I know that sounds nuts, but it's true. They took each of us by the hand and started pulling us towards the rock. We both quickly regained our ability to move. We broke away from their grasp and ran down the hill. As we ran, we could hear them running behind us. A minute or so into the chase, I felt something hit me on the back and realized that one of the beings had thrown a stone at me. I stopped and looked back, but they were gone. Although I could still hear their voices from a distance, it sounded like these were more of these beings, and these sounds were getting louder. We continued running until we reached the car, jumped in, and sped off. We had driven about a half mile when a piece of tree branch came flying out of the woods, hitting the side of the car. I looked up into the woods, but neither of us could see any signs of these strange beings. We were both shaking when we finally arrived home, and we agreed not to tell anyone about the incident, though I think she may have mentioned it to a friend years after we'd gone our separate ways, because there was talk about little people in the surrounding woods. I never had another encounter with these things, but I feel like they knew where I lived. One morning, I found a small pile of stones on my patio picnic table with four-fingered muddy handprint beside it. I recently moved out of the area, but I still have a feeling that they know where I am. Last week, I was leaving for work and walking out to my car. When I got to it, I noticed a reddish-colored 4-fingered handprint on the windshield. I took a closer look, and then I realized that the handprint was made in blood. That evening, while sitting in my office at home, I heard voices outside. I looked out the office window, and that's when I caught a quick glance of something darting into the bushes next door. I continued to watch, but I never saw anything else. I have no idea what's happening, though I do know that I'm not imagining any of this. Is there a possibility of little beings, like hobbits, elves, or trolls, living among us? I've never seen or read about any of this. It all just seems so crazy. Any ideas? Signed, D. Hey TB, thank you for allowing me to send you my story. Every year, my 5 friends and I from high school, we make a trip up to my family's cabin in Iska County, Minnesota, to spend the week drinking, fishing, playing cards, and getting into shenanigans. We started this tradition after our senior year of high school. We've kept it up ever since. The very first year that we all took a minivan from Arizona up to the lake, we would usually stop in Denver, Colorado for the first night, and then make the 17-hour drive up the lake the next day. On the second day of this drive, it was about 1 a.m. in the morning, and we were about an hour away from the cabin. It had just rained, and the road was extremely foggy, and we could hardly see 10 yards in front of the van. On that final stretch, we come around a corner and we see a giant cross glowing in the distance. In that foggy lighting, with little to no sleep, and after 16 hours in the car, the sight of a cross in the distance was, well, ominous, to say the least. As we drive past the cross, we see a run-down, decrepit church, lit up by the light of the cross. My friends will deny it to this day, but I can swear that I saw a light turn on in that church as I drove past it. And in the window, I saw a human-like figure with antlers on its head. I wasn't that tired, and the long drive hadn't affected me. I was completely freaked out and wanted to get as far away from that church as possible, but couldn't drive away quickly because of the fog and the fact that deer were jumping onto the road every few minutes. We ended up eventually making it to the cabin safely, but every time I think back to that drive, I get chills. What do you think I saw? Signed, William. Dear Biker, this happened the night of February 27th, 2017 in the early morning. I was staying at the Best Western in Big Bear. At approximately 12:35 a.m., I walked to my car alone to retrieve my luggage. It had been snowing and was extremely dark, and my car was facing a country road. When I hit the unlock button on my car, the parking and interior lights popped on. This allowed me to see two eyes reflecting in the middle of the road, about 10 to 15 feet away from me. At first I thought it was a deer. Now, I've lived in Colorado and I'm accustomed to seeing wildlife. I instantly stopped and remained still as I didn't want to scare off what I thought was a deer. As my eyes glanced downwards, I noticed that it wasn't a deer. In fact, it looked like a white, hairless, naked man, down on all fours. It was at least 4 feet in height, probably around 15 feet if it stood up. There was a brief moment as our eyes made contact. It then, as quickly as I've ever seen any animal, turned around and ran as fast as a cheetah away from me, and then straight up a tree. I was frozen in disbelief. I yelled out loud to myself, "You gotta be kidding me." Just as I was going to convince myself that this couldn't possibly be happening, it leaped from the treetop to treetop, and I could see its full outline as it did so. Now, I've never heard of such a creature, but I have found some other videos and pictures online that looked exactly like what I saw. The speed and strength it had is like nothing I've ever heard of or seen before. The creature was definitely solid. It appeared as if it was coming towards me, maybe hunting me. I don't know what stopped it. Was it the lights that went on? It had no visible genitalia, and it had very human-like qualities. First, it was a new moon, and I believe it might have been an eclipse that day as well. There was a creek across the street, and I don't know if this has anything to do with my experience, but I was a day out from my period. If this had been a huge-eyed gray alien, it would have made more sense. I've heard of those, but this was unlike anything that I've ever been familiar with. None of this makes sense to me. The speed and agility of that creature. And there shouldn't be any way that the treetops should have been able to hold on the weight of something like that. It appeared to be flashing like a TV, going in and out of reception as it sprinted up that tree. It also didn't appear to disrupt the branches or leaves as it did so. I immediately called my dad after I rushed back to my hotel room. My son was asleep, and I was understandably in a state of shock. At that time, no one knew what hotel I was staying in. As I was crying on the phone with my dad, the hotel phone rang. I answered it, and it was only a dial tone. Then, there was a knock at the hotel room door. Once again, no one was there. At that point, my son woke up due to all the commotion. I told him it was just a scary dream. I gave my dad the hotel information, and he advised me to go wait in the lobby with my son. As we were leaving, there was another knock, but it was at the back sliding glass door that went out to a private, fenced-in patio. This was a one-time encounter, and it's unfortunate that I still live in fear of this experience. I was raised a Christian, and this humanoid doesn't fit into any category with which I am familiar. I don't know why this happened, and what I'm supposed to be learning from it. In addition, the hotel phone number I found out later has 6 sixes in a row. I don't know if that has anything to do with what happened. I was always taught that demons can't have a physical body unless it's possessing someone. I can't imagine it flying a spacecraft due to its primal manner. Was this a trans-dimensional being? A Nephilim? What was it going to do? Is it going to come after me again? Why didn't it do what it was setting out to do the first time? My previous beliefs about the world and the way things work has been tossed upside down. While it's thought-provoking, it's been very traumatic and it's had me in a panic state that's distracting and mostly negative. Thanks for reading. Signed, Anonymous.
Quick editor's note here. For the past several years, I've been hearing about sightings of a humanoid in and around the Big Bear Lake area. From southeast, Big Montero Canyon, along Route 62 into Yucca Valley and Joshua Tree. There have been many reports of people going missing in this area over the years, and a few body parts have even been recovered.
Dear Tattooed Biker, I travel around the country. It's just me and my dog. At the time, we were in Guys Mills, Pennsylvania, up in Crawford County, and we were at this wildlife preserve, the Erie National Wildlife Preserve to be specific. I was doing volunteer work there. So I was there for about 2 weeks and, well, nothing out of the ordinary happened. I and my dog were going for a walk and I saw these, well, they were tracks and they were going in. It had rained really hard earlier that day and they were going down a stone road that I was walking down, so there really wasn't anything I could cast, but they were 18-inch footprints and they had about a 72-inch stride. I got really excited. I was like, wow, now that's pretty cool. I didn't really think any more about it. I mean, this was miles away. We hiked miles, so it was a good ways away from my camper, and I'm camped in the middle of absolutely nowhere. There's the building where they kept all the equipment, and then there was another little building, but other than that, I'm in the middle of a national wildlife preserve, so there's really nothing around me. And they had a little spot for me to camp, for all the volunteers to camp, and we were the only ones allowed there. So it was just me and my dog. And so I scouted the area really well because when I wasn't volunteering, there really wasn't any cell service. So I couldn't get nothing from my mobile hotspot. I couldn't get a TV channel, so it was just me and nature, and to be honest, I kind of like it that way. It was one night in late summer, so it was warm enough for me to have my windows open, and it was probably around 10 at night, and I was sitting there reading, and while I was reading, I started hearing people talking, but I couldn't understand what they were saying. And that caught my interest because, well, I'm in the middle of nowhere, and hearing people, in the middle of nowhere is more frightening than anything. So I stopped what I was doing and I listened, and I could hear them talk, and it sounded like a TV being on in another room with the door closed, where all you could kind of hear was the bass sounds. You know what I'm talking about? So I went outside and I'm looking around and I still couldn't see anything. I came back in and I started hearing the talking again. And I thought, wow, this is really strange. And then the footprints popped into my mind and I thought, okay, I doubt it, but okay. I walked back outside again and I heard the voices kind of moving away, and I still heard the bass sound. Still to this day, I have no idea what that bass sound in their voices was, but it almost sounded like the speakers in the back of a car, and I don't know what that was. I know that I was near Amish country in the middle of nowhere, so I really doubt that somebody had a stereo in the back of their car going down one of these little dirt trails, but maybe. Okay, so the very next night, my dog started going nuts, and he tried getting up underneath where I sleep. So I laid there, and I was on one arm, and I was still lying down, and I bent over to find out what the dog wanted. And the next thing you know, I'm laying on the ground. And you know how when you first wake up, you're really not sure what's going on? So I started getting up, and when I got up, I got pushed against the wall. I got back down, and when I looked up, I could see that everything I had was swaying, and then it hit me that the RV was actually rocking. And I was absolutely terrified. The next day, I went outside, and I found all over my RV these 11.5-inch handprints. So I was terrified, and you should have seen the way the RV was shaking. I have a big 20-foot RV, and if you could see the way it was shaking, it was absolutely frightening. So I'm actually outside, and this is a bird wildlife place. And I'm outside all day, and I can always hear these birds. The people who work there full time got so sick of me asking, "Hey, what bird makes this sound?" that they eventually gave me a book and told me to just try and mimic this bird sound. Get him close, and then I can identify him. So I'm outside, and I'm trying to whistle so I can get this bird close so I can look in this book to see what it is. And later that night, I'm laying in bed, and I have my windows open. And right in the window, in the middle of the night, while it was raining, something goes in the window and makes the same whistling noise. So I jump up, and I can hear that there's more than one, and they're moving around. And they were all whistling that same weird bird call. I can't tell you how scared I was. And there's no way I could even drive off if I wanted to, because I'm hooked up to the water and the electric, and my stairs are down. I couldn't drive off. I couldn't call anyone. I have no reception. I have no internet. I have nothing. And I'm just sitting there like, holy crap, what's going on? And then I start getting rocks thrown at the RV. And my RV is just getting pegged with these rocks, and I'm sitting there. And I wish I could catch it on video. So I'm standing there at the door of my RV, and I'm trying to talk myself into going outside, and it was probably the hardest thing that I've ever had to do. So I finally worked up my nerve, and I did go outside and look through one of those scopes that I'd borrowed from the volunteers. It was a thermal scope, and I did catch something. I don't know what it is exactly. I can't say because I couldn't see it with my naked eyes. I can only see the heat signature, but whatever it was absolutely huge. And it was walking on two legs. I was shaking as I looked at it. I was breathing heavy, and the next thing I knew, I started hearing something coming from behind me. So I quickly ran back inside the RV. I was up all night, almost every night after that. I just couldn't sleep. I was volunteering for about 8 hours during the day. I was coming back, and I was so scared at night that I couldn't sleep. I've gotten better with it, but this was the first time that anything like this has ever happened to me. So the culmination of it all was I was inside, and this is when I left. I wasn't supposed to leave yet, but I really just couldn't do it anymore. I was so scared I was praying. I was dry heaving sometimes, and I woke up to something once trying to open my camper door. So the first thing I do is I just jump up and I stand there, and I can hear the door rattling like someone's trying to open it. Now I don't know why it didn't open, because the way I saw it push this camper, there's no way that thing couldn't just rip my door off. I don't know if it was trying to scare me or what, but the next day, I walk over and it's violently shaking my door. After that, I was done. I didn't want to play anymore, so I took my ball and I went home. The area where I was in, I was kind of on this hill. I think they were camping down or living or whatever they do down in this little valley, because I was down there with my dog a bunch of times. And I didn't see anything, but when I went down there one day, something had pushed a tree over. Then I started finding all these trees shoved into the ground upside down. These trees were alive when they went down, so they weren't exactly broken. They were literally twisted. They were about 6 inches around and completely twisted in half. The experience was absolutely wild. Thanks for reading, Biker. Signed, Derek.
Quick narrator's note here. With a follow-up email, I learned that this incident occurred in August of 2023.
Dear TB, I have an experience that I need to share. I was on the way to the grocery store one day in April, back in 2010, and I saw something standing upright against or kind of behind a tree. At least it looked that way. I saw it as I was crossing a railroad track that eventually went up a hill and a sharp bend at the top, so I didn't stop, fearing that someone would come and hit me from behind. At the time, I tried to tell myself that maybe it was just a tree. So when I came back from the store, whatever I saw wasn't there anymore, and now I just can't explain it. It wasn't the same color as the tree, and that's what made me curious. It was a light reddish brown and beige, almost like the hair was two-toned or something. The hair or fur seemed like it was in jagged tufts that looked like it would be darker underneath if you were to lift it. At the same time, it kind of looked like it'd be soft to the touch, and maybe that's just because I'm a hairdresser. I can't explain what it was since I never saw a face, or did I see any arms or feet, but whatever it was about 7 or 8 feet tall from the ground to where it stopped about 6 to 8 feet alongside that tree. I did notice the part where there was a little more rounded at the top, as if suggesting a shoulder. It wasn't another tree since nothing else in the area was that same color. I wish now that I had gotten someone and looked around for tracks, but by the time I thought of that, it had already rained 3 or 4 times, so they probably wouldn't have been able to find anything by then. I don't know if it could have been a Sasquatch or what it could have been, but whatever it was standing straight and tall and never moved. I don't know if the old big guy was passing by or maybe he's a local. I know there have been sightings to the south of us, Little Bennett Campground in Frederick County, and some north of us in Adams County, Pennsylvania, which is just around 12 to 15 miles from here. I'd like to see him in the daylight again, if that's what I really saw, but I'd probably pee my pants if I were to see him at night. I'm here by myself a lot at night, and our dog wants to always go out. When she does, she acts like she's scared sometimes, since she will stay on the deck and look around. I sometimes wonder what she's looking at. I thought you'd like to know this story. There might be others that come across your channel as I have, with a similar story to tell from the same area. If so, then maybe he's a local. Thanks for inviting me to tell my story. I just had the need to tell you because now you have this for reference in case someone else comes forward and tells you their story. I will definitely keep my eyes open and let you know if I notice anything else. I kind of got the feeling that these things, if that is what it is, are very adapted to blend into their surroundings. It actually looked like it would have been soft if I were to touch it. I can't get that out of my head. People go out looking for Bigfoot all the time. They go places where they think they'll see him, and all the time he's probably right there in their backyard. I have read that he will find you before you find him, and now I believe that. Thanks. Signed, Jillian.
Quick narrator's note here. This area, which is coincidentally only about 40 minutes south of me, is historically well known for Bigfoot and cryptid canine sightings.
Dear Tattooed Biker, my neighbor, we'll call her Sue here, is an avid outdoors woman. Ever since I moved to the neighborhood about 10 years ago, she's been off hiking in the forest, the mountains, or high desert plateau every weekend and holiday. And then suddenly, last September, she sold off all her camping and climbing gear. After a month of just being a homebody, she finally took up windsurfing. Early in January, she knocked on my door and asked if I wanted to hear a strange story. I could tell that something was eating at her, and so I invited her in, having just put on a pot of tea. One pot of tea and a plate of gingerbread cookies later, and I'd gotten the whole story out of her. You see, back in September, she had gone hiking on one of those last beautiful days before winter and the rains. She told me the exact location, but I don't feel right about releasing this information, only that it was in the Cascades. Several hours into the hike, she started to notice a distant, stinking smell like rotten eggs and manure. Because she was hiking along a small seasonal creek, she thought that maybe something like a deer had disturbed some skunk cabbage in the area. It was a little late in the season for skunk cabbage, but not impossibly so. Sue said that the smell didn't dissipate for about 20 minutes and then it was suddenly gone. As the trail climbed to a higher elevation, she began to feel like that she was being watched. Because she still had miles to go before she reached the campsite, she never stopped, but she remained alert, as mountain lions are known to be in the area. This went on for about 10 or more minutes, and then, as she was coming around a boulder, someone grabbed her by the shoulder and threw her to the ground. Stunned, and with the wind knocked out of her, she lay there for a moment, when a short fellow with facial tattoos and a machete threatened her and shouted at her in Spanish. We have a problem with gangs growing Mary Jane in the backwoods. Most of it was cleared up when Washington State and Oregon legalized recreational weed, but some gangs still grow it for the purpose of selling in Idaho. Sue doesn't speak any Spanish, but thought the guy was going to assault and kill her, given that he straddled her and grabbed her shirt, trying to rip it off her. That was when the most horrific roar came from the bushes. It was so loud that Sue said that she felt it reverberating deep in her chest. That was also when she initially placed it at about 10 feet tall, but later said it might have been only about 8 feet, and she was rather terrified at the moment. A really tall, hairy person grabbed the guy on top of her and threw him into the trees. Perhaps needless to say, Sue didn't stick around. She ran back down the trail until she collapsed about an hour out from her car, by her estimation, from sheer exhaustion. When she came around, she was laid out on the trailhead, covered in leaf litter. She swears she was too far from the trailhead when she passed out, and she certainly wouldn't have had the peace of mind to cover herself in leaves. It was getting on to twilight at that point, so she limped her way back to her car and drove back to Portland. The next day, she sold all of her camping and climbing gear. I asked her if she noticed a smell during the attack. I asked her what she felt had saved her. Sue was very hesitant to answer, but of her own volition finally said that it had to be a Sasquatch. Because I felt like I had to play the devil's advocate, I asked if it could have been just a guy or a hunter in a ghillie suit. She shook her head and was very adamant that a hunter would have used a gun and not been able to throw a guy a good 20 feet. Also, she added that she didn't think any human could make the sound of that roar. Again, I asked her if she noticed a smell during the attack, but she was a little too busy running away to notice. She did mention that when she came to on the trailhead, her clothes had a strange smell on them, but she had thrown them out since then. I did ask her if I could share her story, and she was okay with it, but didn't want to tell it ever again, and if I asked about it, would flat out deny that it ever happened. I think that I was her confessional that day. We're still on friendly terms, but I respected her request to never mention it to her again. She windsurfs almost every weekend now, but she refuses to go back into the forest. And to be honest, I really don't blame her. One last note, I emailed the county sheriff's office with details about the attack. Well, minus the rescue by Bigfoot. If the guy that attacked her was still out there and alive, then law enforcement needs to be aware that there's a marijuana grow near a campsite. Thank you for reading this. Signed, Anonymous. I don't have any idea what I witnessed on May the 28th, 2013, but it was the most frightening experience of my life. My wife and I were camping at an RV park near Jasper, Arkansas, and we planned to be there for several days. We arrived early Saturday and got situated soon after. My wife wanted to look around the area since she had never been to the Ozarks. I was born and raised in the mountains and was familiar with the terrain and the wildlife. After we tinkered around the campsite, we decided to take a short hike through a nearby valley. There were a few caves and caverns along the way, but nothing where I would have guessed any large predator might be living. After walking for an hour, we started to head back towards the RV park. Not long after we started walking back down the trail, something caught my eye. It was in the dense thicket off the side of the trail. My wife sensed it as well and stopped to look over in the same direction. There I could see this dark, four-legged creature moving back and forth slowly through the brush. We immediately started to walk at a fast pace back towards the park. The creature was moving along as well, keeping its distance, but still tracking us. This continued for what seemed like 10 minutes until we finally reached the clearing. We got back to the campsite very shaken and nervous. In all my years growing up in these mountains, I had never seen anything comparable to it. From what I could gather, it was very large, the size of a black bear or bigger, but it moved close to the ground like a cat. It was also very dark in color. We didn't say anything to the other campers nearby. The rest of the evening was fairly quiet and peaceful up until around 2:15 a.m., and that's when we heard what sounded like a high-pitched howl coming from the distance. It was loud enough to wake both of us, and I noticed several campers were looking outside, milling around and talking about the sound. Someone said it might be a coyote, but that wasn't a coyote or anything else I'd ever heard before. The next morning, we woke around 9 a.m., and when I stepped out of the RV, a woman walked up to me and asked if I had heard the howling. I said that I did, but didn't have any idea what it was. The woman, who was camping nearby, said that she believed it to be the Ozark howler. There had been a few sightings recently. I knew the stories about the Ozark howler, but had never believed in any of them. Well, my wife was ready to leave ASAP. Now, I'm not sure what to think. We came home today and I looked up the Ozark howler. There isn't much to go on. I've listened to your channel and thought you may want to get the word out. Is it possible that this creature is real? Signed, Jay.
A quick narrator's note here. Information on this cryptid is scant, as well as the history is vague. There's a few anecdotal accounts, but nothing to really hang your hat on, so to speak.
Dear Mr. Biker, I'll be upfront and honest with you. I'm one of those who want to believe. However, I'm also one of those who are very skeptical. I've read the books of Eric Von D, Robert Bauval, and others. Mainstream media has tickled my interest in Da Vinci and the Freemasons. For over 15 years now, I'm now in my early 30s, I've always had a love of Mayan, Incan, and ancient Egyptian societies. Maybe a year or so ago, while watching something on the History Channel, I was browsing the internet and came across your YouTube channel. I've followed you on and off since then, and your post of the lizard humanoids kind of hit home for me. I felt that if this person could come forward, then I know I'm not alone, and they may also know that they aren't alone in having some kind of experience. You see, I was born and raised in Northeast Ohio, I had a normal upbringing, or what some would call normal. My parents are still married. Went to church on Sundays. I had a dog, a picket fence, and all those things. I did a little marijuana in high school, but I rarely drink, and there's only one reported case of a mental illness in my family. When I was about 12 or 13 years old, I remember having a very vivid dream where I was sitting in my living room watching TV. While watching TV, in my dream I was viewing myself in third person. Something made me want to look out through the dining room window and out through the large sliding glass door and into the backyard. When I turned my head, it was completely dark outside. And then, in an almost comedic way of film, this giant moon slid up from below the horizon, like from the 9 to 12 o'clock position on the clock. The moon was enormous, almost filling the sky, and it was brilliantly white. As I sat dumbfounded in my dream staring out the back window, something pulls my legs out from under me while I'm sitting on them on the floor. This startled me, but while in my dream I was still staring at the moon, and this voice, from what I can only assume was in my head, said, "It's almost over." This dream frightened me horribly. So much so that I woke up hot and sweaty, only to find my bedroom door partially open with a small dark figure closing the door, and without moving his mouth says, "Don't tell." I don't really recall any of the small humanoid's features. I just recall him being about 3 feet tall and seeing the figure darker than gray complexion, and nothing moved on its face when I heard it speak. Even to this day, this incident is one of the most vivid memories that I have. Seeing your photo of the reptile man was nearly like pulling a photo out of my head from that last memory. I mentioned nothing of this occurrence until just a few years ago to a close friend. I never even told my wife. Well, eventually I went off to college, came back home, got married, and had a couple of kids. And just over a year ago, I bought my parents' house. On and off since the encounter, whatever you'd like to call it, because at this point I don't know. I get this feeling like I'm being observed. Not the kind of being watched, where you're sitting up at night, unable to sleep, and you feel like someone is watching you through the window. More like something is waiting for me as I walk into rooms and sitting in the car with me while I drive to work. This was only in small increments, and I've never felt it to be constant, but since moving back home, I'm feeling it more and more so. My son, he's at the fun age of 5 now, and recently started talking about some guy he met here at home named Kyle Fokker. He tells my wife and I that he's seen him all over the house. Yeah, I know he's a child with an imagination, but the whole time I'm giving him the 20 questions about his new friend, well, I'm rattling my brain on what TV show, commercial, or movie that would have caused them to come up with this. And so far, I haven't come up with anything. While that was going on, I was in the kitchen just a week or so ago, talking to my mom, and for some reason, I felt compelled to look the other way, and I see a dark figure. This figure that I saw had an upside-down triangle for a torso and a rectangular block for a head. When I turned to look, I could tell that it looked at me, because while my brain was trying to comprehend what I'd just seen, I could see that the blockhead sort of rotated and proceeded to take an immediate left and zip its way through my stairs that go up to our bedrooms. From everything that I know, no one has ever died on this property. My grandfather, who lived with my parents and me at my current location for a few years, from the time I was 6 until I was in high school, became ill with Alzheimer's and later passed away, having a complication from a stroke, but that was at a hospice center. But I'm afraid partially for my sanity, but more for my family. Although no one has been hurt in any way, I can't help but think, like a father and husband, and want to protect my family from any possible threat. But my issue here is that, what the hell am I even dealing with? Possible alien, a spirit, a mental illness? Maybe all the above. Am I seeing one thing and my son seeing something else? I just don't know. Thanks for reading. Signed, Anonymous. Hey TB, I'm 24 now, but this happened during my senior year in high school. I lived at home, near Winnipeg, Manitoba at the time, and by my house there were 2 elementary schools, separated by some forest, joined together by a paved bicycle walking trail through this forest. It was nighttime, and my best friend at the time and I were out walking the trail from one school to the other. To paint a good picture of what this trail was like, for some reason there were only street lights at the end of the trail, where you'd be entering school property. The trail itself was pitch black, making it super eerie at night. Anyway, my buddy and I were coming around a bend just outside of where the first school was, and where there was a light, but as we approached the bend in the trail, we finally made it to a point where the light was barely lighting up the trail anymore. I was walking with my head down, looking at my phone, and my friend was just a few steps ahead, talking. And then, just out of nowhere, he stops, and he says, "What the hell is that?" Naturally, I stopped too, and at first, I didn't see anything. I caught up to where he was a few steps ahead of me, and he said, "Look over there, in the bush, at that white thing." Now, when I saw this thing, I absolutely froze, because sitting at the side of the trail, just off the pavement, in the tall grass was, well, this hunched over, super pale and white thing that kind of looked like a person who was super skinny to the point that I could see its spine and bones and ribcage. When I first saw it, it had its back to us, and then it slowly turned towards us. It looked like a bald, pale, naked white man with absolutely no hair, severely undernourished, with sunken eyes and super long arms. Then it started moving towards us on all fours like some kind of animal. We didn't even say a word to each other. We just both immediately started running the opposite direction to get home. We sprinted the entire way back, which was about 1.5 kilometers. We told my parents when we got there, and the next day in the daylight, of course, my mom and I went back where my friend and I saw this thing. And sure enough, right where we saw it was a bunch of packed down long grass, as if something were sitting or laying there. I naturally messaged this friend who witnessed it with me as I was writing this, and he still remembers it clear as day, and the fact that it looked almost like a creature mixed with a human. We still have no clue what it was. Signed, Finn. Dear Tattooed Biker, I saw Bigfoot once, and I'll never forget the experience. It was the month of July in 2009 here in Fairbanks. I was heading south on Auburn Drive toward Farmer's Loop, which was about 1 mile away. It's a wooded area frequented by homes and, in general, would be considered populated. Houses are on average about 100 to 200 feet apart, with only the general area around and close to the homes cleared out. Most of the spaces is wooded. It was this section of road where it passes by Pearl Creek Elementary School. The school can be seen through the woods. Some of the woods in the area are pretty thick, and in some places you can't see into them for more than about 10 or 15 feet, but in this particular area, it had been recently cleared, and sight lines into the section of the siding were very open. The school and vegetable garden could be seen off to the right from the road I was on, and it was about 6 p.m., and I was heading home after a day of work on a deck that I was building. The weather was clear with the sun high in the sky. As I was driving, I just happened to notice a man standing off by the right side of the road, about 100 yards up ahead. It was more of an unconscious recognition because, well, there's nothing really unusual about a man standing on the side of the road in this area. As I got to within about 50 yards, I took a closer look. "That's no man," I said to myself. Shortly after that, maybe 1 or 2 seconds, this thing just bolted into the woods toward the school. It did it like a wild animal would do if it were spooked. I didn't slow down until I got to the place where I saw him go up into the woodline, which is where I stopped. I could see him running away from the road, and when he was into the woods, about 30 yards or so, he turned left and was now running parallel to the road in the direction that I was heading. I got a pretty good look at him, but not his face. I could have probably seen his face had I not been so mesmerized by the sheer presence of this thing. I was just busy noticing other things. For one thing, he was covered in fur or hair that looked to be about 3 or 4 inches long all over the main part of his body. It was a reddish, rusty color. I was mildly struck by just how red it was, but it was definitely very rusty. He was about 8 feet tall and looked to weigh about 400 pounds. He ran with a strange, hoppy kind of run. It wasn't a limp for sure, but with one foot he would push off like a normal running move. But with the other foot, when he pushed off, it propelled him upward and forward. I watched him until he disappeared into the woods. There was a road about 100 yards ahead, and I took off to get to it so I could turn right, and in 20 yards turn right again. This road that led into the school parking lot. So basically, the wooded area that he was in was sort of a peninsula, and he seemingly had to be in there somewhere. The woods I was looking into from that angle were quite thick, and I didn't see him, and haven't seen him since. A little farther up on the right was the school garden that had people in it, which I'm now sorry that I didn't stop to go talk to them about what I'd seen. The next day, as I was driving into work on the deck, I naturally slowed down in the area where I saw him. And I was surveying the area when a couple walking their dogs were approaching. I flagged them down and told them the story of what happened that evening before, and they told me that about a week before that, they were there with their dogs and were on the way other side of the school property by the soccer field when 3 kids came running over to them, saying, "Did you see the Bigfoot? Did you see the Bigfoot?" They also said that what appeared to be a dad was with them, who didn't seem real excited about it. My conclusion to whether it was real or not is simply summed up by saying it was either very real or there was a man in a very, very convincing costume. I actually reported the sighting to the Fish and Game office in Fairbanks a few days later. The person who was taking the report was sort of rolling his eyes through the whole thing, and he seemed to be writing it down on a piece of scrap paper. I even had to remind him to take my phone number, just in case. Then I stumbled on your channel, and I thought I would share it here. Thanks, Biker. Signed, Daniel. Dear TB, I had a really frightening experience once that I wanted to share and see what you think. It happened when my mother and I had taken my young Doberman to the Honey Island swamp to let him run and get some exercise. We had driven to the end of the road where the bridge had collapsed, and you couldn't go back any further by car. The area is a few miles from the Honey Island exit, off of Interstate 59 here in Mississippi. The road was built up about 8 feet from the ground since it flooded back there. The area around the road was swampy and filled with trees. The ground was covered in leaves since it was fall. We had been there about 10 minutes, and my dog had been pretty much just staying on the road as he ran around. I went to get something out of the car, and when I started walking back to where my mom was on the road, she was looking out into the wooded area at something. She pointed out what appeared to be something dark beside a large cypress tree. We couldn't make out a head, but it appeared to be gray or black, fur-covered torso. Whatever we were looking at was absolutely huge because it stood above some bushes, and the top part was behind the branches of a tree. It had to have been well over 7 feet tall since the bushes were at least 4 feet tall. It was definitely not another tree because you could see the texture was so different from the big tree it was standing next to. It was right around 1 p.m. and the sun was bright. The light was dappled through the tree cover, but we could see that it was shining off what appeared to be hair or something with a hairy texture. It also seemed to be shifting back and forth, almost swaying nervously, as if you were to shift your weight from one leg to another. It was probably only 50 feet away from us, so we got a real good look at it. We didn't hear or smell anything, and my dog didn't seem to notice anything out of the ordinary. After looking at it for at least 2 or 3 minutes, we got very uncomfortable all of a sudden. I actually got chill bumps, even though it was a warm, sunny day, and we decided that we would drive a mile or so up past one of the bridges on the way back to the interstate. We put my dog in the car and we drove at least a mile up the road before we stopped again to let my dog back out. When we had been there about 5 minutes, we heard heavy footsteps in the woods and snapping branches. We could hear whatever it was getting closer. This time, my dog quickly picked up on the sound and became alert. We could hear it stop, and then move forward a few steps, and then stop again. We couldn't see anything, but my dog was definitely trying to figure out what he was hearing. We got that same uncomfortable feeling again, but much more intense. The chill bumps returned, so we loaded up again, and this time drove up to where there are some nature trails and a shooting range, probably a full 2 miles up the road. We got out of the car again and weren't there but just a few minutes when we heard what sounded like something huge running through the woods towards us. At that point, my dog got so scared that he bolted back to the car, actually hit the closed car door to try and get back in. My mom and I ran to the car, and all 3 of us got out of there as fast as we could. We never saw what was making the noise in the woods, but whatever it was big enough to make a lot of noise, both walking and especially running through those woods. After leaving and having a major discussion about what had happened, my mom and I finally decided to get up our nerve and go back to the end of the road later that day. It was about 4:30 p.m. by that time, to see if what we had seen earlier was still there. When we got there, we couldn't find what we had seen before. We're pretty sure we saw what was the same big tree, but we didn't see what was standing by it originally. And we weren't nearly brave enough to go into the wooded area for a closer look. So we basically left with even more questions than we started out with. We never had a clear view of what we saw, but what we heard definitely scared us. Thanks for letting me share. Signed, Rhonda. Hey TB, I have at least what I think is a Bigfoot sighting to report, and I'd love your viewers' input. You see, I was hunting elk with my brother-in-law up in Chalk Creek. That's in Summit County here in Utah. We had been in this deep canyon for some time, and it was getting dark, so we were headed out of it. I can still see all of this in my head clearly. We were climbing up out of a small draw onto a flat meadow. As we got to the top of it, we got smacked in the face by this horrible, rotten garbage, musky smell. Right before, we both saw something very tall and black in color run into a small stand of pine trees. And it let out a huge woof sort of sound as it went in. Also, it used long, powerfully built arm to sweep a pine bough out of its way that flipped from the ground to about 5 feet in the air. My brother-in-law said, "What the heck is that?" as he chambered a shell. This stand of pines was no bigger than a front yard, and there was a clearing behind it. Now, I've thought on this for a long time, and I think that because we could smell it so strong, we must have been downwind of it, so it didn't catch our scent before we came in contact with it, and so we ended up surprising each other. The creature was to our left, and we had a beaver dam to our right. The thing was about 30 feet away from us in the pines. We were on a deer path between the pond and the pines. We backed up, and when we did, this thing let out a low, guttural growl at us. It was so deep I could feel it rattle in my chest, and you could actually hear its teeth chatter at the end of the growl. Now, I've felt fear before in my life, but not anything like this. It's like a sense of pure evil came over me. On the way home, we talked about what we had seen. We were so close to this thing. I know for a fact it wasn't a bear or a moose. A bear doesn't move that fast on its hind legs. And I used to work at Lagoon in Farmington. It's an amusement park, and I used to feed the animals down there. They had a leopard that would growl at you when you walked by its cage, and the growl was almost like what I heard on that mountain. I've been in the hills all my life, and I've never seen or heard anything like that before, and, well, I hope I never do again. Thanks. Signed, Art. Hey, Tattooed Biker. I wanted to share an encounter I had with Bigfoot when I was just 15 years old, visiting my grandparents up from Miami, Florida. While on a walk through a remote forest section of Lake Cowee, South Carolina at twilight, I saw a very large shape walk up a section from the lake at about a 20% incline from left to right across a dirt road and into the dense forest on my right. I was maybe 50 yards away when it saw me. The light was very low, but I saw this thing, and it wasn't human at all. It was at least 7 to 8 feet tall and looked to be about 450 pounds. No neck and reddish in color. When I bolted into a panic, this thing, it ran up the hill and then started to run parallel the road on which I was running. And I'll never forget the scream that it let out. The cove was like an amphitheater, but it sounded like a cow and a pig being killed on a rock concert sound system. Afterwards, many people, my pastor among many, indicated that this creature had been seen and heard for many years in this area. I now hold a degree in zoology. Also, one night I was watching Monster Quest, and I heard a Bigfoot scream. When that happened, my girlfriend said I turned completely pale and started to shake. This thing is real, no question about it. Signed, Owen. Hey, Tattooed Biker. I've debated whether or not to report my encounter, or to tell anyone at all for that matter, for a pretty long time. I don't know why, but I guess I wanted to keep this experience to myself for a few years, and then it just doesn't seem to matter as far as telling anyone. But now, I realize that all encounters and sightings of these things need to be shared, because they do exist, and people need to know what's really out there. My encounter happened in early June of 2010. I had taken a friend to the Marionville Timberline ATV trails, northeast of Marionville, Pennsylvania, in the Allegheny National Forest, to ride ATVs for the day. Allegheny National Forest covers approximately 515,000 acres, or 800 square miles of protected wilderness in northwest Pennsylvania. The forest is pretty dense in most spots and has many different types of terrain. From my understanding, the Allegheny National Forest is one of the least densely populated areas east of the Mississippi River. Surrounding the forest are more woodlands and even more farm country. The two trail systems that we were riding that weekend join together and make an approximate 60 to 80 mile loop from the northern end down to the bottom, and then back up the other side of the loop. My encounter happened on our return back up, heading north. I remember it had rained very hard the night before and through the early morning because my friend, who was new to ATV riding, didn't bring rain gear. We had to go into town to buy him some cheap gear, and then we headed back up the trail. It rained for the first half hour or so of our ride, and I remember the sun coming out and it was turning into a really nice day. For those that ride ATVs, they know that the rain makes mud, which is even more fun to ride in than the dust. A few hours into the ride, having stopped and observed some beaver dams, some very old oil wells, a couple of logged out areas where you could see for what seemed like miles, and other cool sights that the forest has to offer, I was getting more in a hurry to get back. It was approaching the end of the day. My buddy was way behind me, so I decided to stop on the trail and just wait for him. I usually don't separate from my buddies when riding, but this part of the trail was an abandoned logging trail, and pretty easy, so I rode ahead to wait for him. He didn't ride fast or dangerous, he sort of just putted, so I knew he was safe, just slow. If he didn't show up soon, I would turn around and go back and look for him. I wasn't sitting that long. I had just taken my helmet off, and that's when I noticed rocks kept hitting the front right side of my ATV. They weren't large rocks, maybe about or just smaller than marble-sized. It took a minute or so before it occurred to me that I was stopped, and those rocks shouldn't be flying through the air and hitting my ATV. I was turning my head towards the right to follow the path of these strange air rocks, as I called them, when my turn stopped, and I noticed this stump-looking thing, which turned out to be a dark figure, approximately 70 to 90 feet away. It appeared to be sitting or in a crouching, low position. And then, as I was watching, it stood up into an upright position. I'll never forget how it seemed to pop right up, like it was on a spring, with seemingly no effort. Initially, for some reason, I looked at its hands because I was interested to see what was in its hand, if anything. This thing, it was much, much taller than a normal human. My best guess at this point would be 7.5 feet or so, and it absolutely was not a bear. It was very, very broad at the shoulders, almost freakishly broad. I remember that very well. It was on 2 legs, and I could see its right arm hanging down, which was on the left side because it was facing me. For some reason, I remember wanting to watch its right hand to see if it was armed or what it might be doing. That all seems funny to me now because for some reason I was assuming that whatever this thing was, it was right-handed. It moved its right arm to a slightly bent position, stopping, with its hand in front of it at about its waist. Its left arm stayed hanging to its side. Very long arms, that is. It was all very dark black, almost a shiny black, from head to toe, or as far as I could see to its feet, because it was standing in 1.5 to 2 feet grass. As my eyes made their way up the creature, I could see its head was all black as well. There was no white or lighter color that seemed to stand out at all. Like most animals would have lighter colors on their face. I couldn't see any clear details of the face, as it was all black, but as well it didn't appear to have hair on its face. It appeared to be what looked like black skin, the same color black as its hair, but I could tell it wasn't hair in some spots. I noticed that the eyes were even black, were very, very dark and deep, with a pronounced brow ridge. I could obviously tell it had a face, I just couldn't see any detail of the lips or anything, as it was all the same color. The lips were closed, though, and in a straight line across its face, not open-mouthed or a smile or a frown, just straight lips. The hair was short to medium length and not shaggy. I'd say the hair was on average of maybe 3 to 5 inches long, shorter at the head. It was almost groomed in appearance, but I think it's from the hair being short and thick. At least, that was my impression. Oddly, I didn't notice any mud or dirt on it at all, which seemed odd because it had rained hard the night before and it didn't stop for several hours before this. The trails were very muddy. Almost as soon as my eyes were at its head and face, and I was trying to zoom in and get a better look, it began to leave. It didn't turn and walk away, but Rather, it stepped straight backwards into the brush and the trees, never taking its eyes away from me. It stayed square to me as it was moving backwards. Now, this all happened in the span of no more than 30 seconds, from the time that I noticed the rocks hitting my ATV up until it moved backwards. When I played it over and over in my mind, it feels more like 30 minutes. At this point, an overwhelming fear just filled my mind, and I remember feeling like I shouldn't be in this spot right now. I don't remember shaking in fear or anything like that, but I felt warm and almost like I was going to puke. So I hit the gas and I just took off. I wished now that I wouldn't have just fled, but the feeling that suddenly came over me wasn't anything like something I had experienced before. I had my smartphone camera in my fender bag, and it never once occurred to me to get it out and start videoing or try to take a photo. I honestly just couldn't move for a short period of time. I've been surprised by people walking up on me in the woods, and I've hunted all my life. So animal encounters, even a bear from a distance, doesn't scare or alarm me. I was also in the military for 6 years and actually had the honor to serve as SEAL Team 4. During that time, I had many anxious experiences, as one could imagine. To summarize, I'm pretty observant. I don't have a tendency to overreact, and I don't scare easy. I'm very level-headed and definitely not crazy. I didn't instantly think Bigfoot, as I wasn't a real believer then. At least I doubted their existence in the eastern U.S., and if they existed at all, it was in northwest U.S., Canada, or maybe Alaska. This encounter took my emotions into places that they hadn't been, or at least hadn't been for a long time. It has been going through my head for over 4 years, and I didn't tell anybody except my fiance within the first year after the encounter. Now, quite a few people know that the person I was riding with that day just found out in 2014. I never told him about the story before, but because I couldn't remember if it was springtime or early summer or late summer fall when this happened, I asked him what week if he remembered. When he told me it was springtime, early summer, he naturally asked why, what's up? I told him then what happened. It turns out that he believes in these creatures too. He then realized why I was acting so weird when we finally caught back up with each other. And then on the 2.5-hour truck ride home. Now I wish I would have told him then. Maybe we could have joined together and gone back to look for signs or whatever we could find. Instead, the overwhelming feeling of, what the heck was that, and I can't tell anybody, they won't believe me anyways, took over, and I just kept it to myself. Nobody has to tell me what I saw or didn't see. I know what I saw. I saw a large, dark figure with hair that could throw rocks very accurately, stand up from within 100 feet of me, in a large, dense forest where there aren't any cabins or people just hanging out. I still leave the option open for an extremely large man, larger than anyone I've ever met, in a heavily padded ghillie suit with hair on it, standing about 100 foot from the trail just waiting for someone to stop in that exact spot so he could throw rocks at them and take a chance of getting shot. Now that's being sarcastic, but trying to make truth out of what happened. Of course, that option is slim, but it'll always be there. I didn't walk up to this thing and shake its hand or try and hug it. So being 100% sure it was a Sasquatch just isn't possible. I am at the 99.999% sure, though. What I do know is that a fear like I've not felt in a long time, if ever, took over me for a while. Something told me to go, to move on, and that I shouldn't be there right then. Again, I'm an overly rational person, and this just didn't make sense to me at all. I eventually plan on returning to that general area on ATV and parking the bike and doing some walking. I just need to look around and feel comfortable with that. Ever since my encounter, I just can't put this down. I've been researching around since and came across various online groups that discuss encounters. I want to learn just as much as I can before returning and going looking around, and I want to go armed with more knowledge than I have now. I did finally return to the trail, and I found the area that it happened in. It was strange being there. Some of my biggest questions since learning more about these creatures are, what was it doing there, so close to used ATV trails? And why did it draw my attention to itself? If it hadn't thrown those rocks, I never would have looked. And if it hadn't stood up, I might not have noticed it at all. Someone told me that maybe it was traveling and recently crossed that trail. The reason for rock throwing and drawing attention to it was possibly to draw attention to it on purpose, so my attention wouldn't go to something else nearby, maybe something less able to protect itself. I interpreted that as young ones. That never crossed my mind. Just to realize that one was in the area blew my mind away and made me start thinking differently about what could be out there. Now, there may have been more. I'll never really know that for sure. But it does make sense to that question that's been bugging me. I now wonder if there were young ones close to me. Maybe they were the one throwing the rocks, being mischievous. It's still hard for me to grasp that anything could throw rocks from approximately 90 feet away and hit the same general area so very accurately. If it wanted to harm me, it could have beamed me in the head and I wouldn't be writing this encounter. I've since been researching an area about 25 miles west of this location. I had gone from not caring or thinking about Sasquatch to being a full-blown enthusiast. I even attend conferences now. Now, I'm not looking for any type of notoriety out of this, but I feel that folks need to know about this and that these creatures do actually exist. So I've started sharing my story with anyone who'll listen. Anybody who knows me will tell you that I'm a very honest person. It's one of my strongest qualities. I know there are many made-up and hoax Bigfoot stories out there, but I can assure you that this is not one of them. I wasn't out looking for Bigfoot that day. I didn't ask for this encounter to happen, but it did. And it changed a lot of things about me. I stopped hunting deer, and I haven't hunted since that day. I now cannot put Bigfoot stuff down, and I've even started a Bigfoot book collection with some very old and hard to find autographed Bigfoot books. Now, this doesn't happen to a person overnight unless something happened, something to change them. That day certainly did change me. Thank you for letting me share my story for your channel. Signed, Brian. Hey Tattooed, I've got something to share, and well, this story is a very personal one and a very long one, so I appreciate the time you're going to take to read this. Just to be clear, the story you're about to read is 100% real. It happened to me and I remember it like it was yesterday, but it actually happened over 3 decades ago. You see, I was born on July 14th, 1958, so at the time of this tale I was 33 years old, and it happened on August 28th. My dad would always take me and my brother, Jeremiah, hunting and fishing, so that custom stayed with us forever. That day, it was 1991. I was hunting in Jackson Demonstration State Forest in Mendocino County, California, with my brother Jeremiah. It was a little bit difficult to pattern the deer there because of the water, and the area is extremely thick with lots of young growth. 2 hours had passed, and we only had 4 rabbits on the day, so we started to think about getting out of there. But we stayed for 1 more hour, just to make it worth our while. When we finally agreed that it was time to go, we heard something coming from behind us. Then, there was this loud scream. Not a human scream, an animal scream. But it wasn't any animal that we'd ever heard before. So we decided to go back and look for the source of the sound. As we approached the area we thought that it came from, we noticed that there was nothing there. We started to search the area, but as we were doing that, I felt the presence of someone, and I instantly felt I was being watched. I turned around looking for someone or something, and I found something in the distance, hiding behind some trees. I didn't call out to my brother, as I didn't feel it was important at the time, but when I had almost reached the trees, I saw a heavily built, hairy man running across the tree line. I grabbed my .22 rifle and followed the footprints left behind by the creature, and after some 3 or 4 minutes of following, I finally caught up with the thing that left those enormous footprints. He was only about 30 feet away from me. I hid as best I could, and he didn't see me, but he certainly heard me because he started looking around and making some weird noises, as if he was trying to communicate. At first, I wasn't sure if I should step away from my hiding spot or not, but I finally decided to do so. I stood up there and pointed my rifle at him, slowly approaching until I was just 15 feet away. Looking at him, I noticed he was like 8 to 9 feet tall. He had reddish hair that covered him almost completely. Just part of his face and the palms of his hands had no hair. I also noticed that he had some white hair in his torso. He just looked at me and stood there, making those weird chattering noises, but suddenly locked eyes with me and actually mouthed the words, "No danger," very slowly, almost unintelligible, while he pointed at himself. At this point, I was stunned, and I lowered my rifle and still watching him. The nervous expression on his face had disappeared, and then he just turned and started walking into the forest. I turned around and started looking for my brother, still very much in shock. When I found him, he too was a wreck. I told him what had happened, and he told me that he saw one too, a female creature with her baby in its hands. I'm not sure, but it's very possible that the Sasquatch I found was the mate of the one my brother found, and the little one their brood. While we were making our way back to the road, I looked back, and I swear I saw him, off in the distance, observing us as we were leaving. We never talked about this to anyone, but my brother contacted me recently with another story that I may share with you some other time. And because of that and this story, I became very intrigued about the subject, so I thought I'd share this story with a few people. Here are some things about the Sasquatch that I encountered that I remember very clearly. He had reddish-brownish hair and white hairs on his torso. He had a deep voice, but was capable of screaming at a very high pitch. His footprints were like 18 inches long and 9 or 10 inches wide. He also had very, very big hands, but they looked very similar to those of a human, just much more hairy. He had hair in his face that formed some kind of beard, and he also had some hair on his forehead, but his skin was more or less light-colored, with a wide nose and wide lips. He looked almost like a hybrid human ape, almost like a Neanderthal. He was extremely muscular. He didn't seem to be able to stand up completely straight for very long. He had a somewhat clumsy-looking way of walking, but he could certainly run pretty fast. And he had some kind of language that reminded me of a human language. He apparently knew a few words of English, and he seemed to be a peaceful being. I appreciate you for letting me share. Signed, Dominic. Dear Biker, I live in the mountains of Tennessee, and well, something has been knocking on my door around 11:30 to about 2 a.m., maybe once every week, and has been going on for quite a while. When it first started, I had thought about your BEK videos, and it gave me enough credence to not go outside. I've also had to start keeping the glass door locked because something kept opening it. The night before I started locking it, the door opened, and this huge hand covered my peephole. So I started locking that door. The next morning, I discovered where someone had urinated on the glass door. Every time we clean that door, something comes back and pees on it, every single time. I've left it this last time, and whatever is doing it must stand at least 4.5 feet off the ground, which is where the pee starts. My neighbor and I have this same problem. We started comparing notes and, well, we've decided that we have a hairy person problem. So between us, we call him Harry. He doesn't come around much in the winter, which is interesting. Our Harry smells like a wet skunk with just a touch of dirty wet dog. We've learned that when Harry comes around, we pick up that skunk odor, which doesn't linger. When a real skunk comes around, the odor lingers. Around Easter, something came around that was, well, absolutely putrid. Evidently, it was a different hairy person. This one had the classic stomach-turning odor. It's been around here twice now. The knocking is very annoying. The dogs always lunge at it. There are evenings when it will knock twice, I swear, just for the pure entertainment value. My neighbor and I decided to experiment on the knocking. I was telling her about it. At the time, my front door was closed. I knocked on the glass. The little dogs, exhausted from barking all day Friday, ignored it. I knocked on the wooden frame and they started yapping, but there was no lunging. It was more like a, "I heard your knocking, now quit it." I'm beginning to think that Harry knocks just to drive them crazy. If he were up to something truly frightening, it would be very simple to knock in a window and create a disaster. But he just snoops around the windows. He never touches them, but he knocks at the front door. If it were just me, I would say I'm losing my mind. Luckily, he does the same thing to my neighbor. Like she said, it's as though he's trying to antagonize the little dogs, just for the heck of it. I've been collecting things for a garage sale, and figured it would come around to look. One Friday morning, we had put out my mother's Christmas wreaths to sell. They had been wrapped in big garbage bags. Sure enough, that night, Harry came around, knocked on the door, and prowled around a little. My neighbor and I messaged back and forth while it was going on. She smelled him, and then I smelled him. He prowled around for a good hour. We even know where he might be hiding, which is kind of freaky. Yesterday morning, I went out to put things back out for the garage sale, and I went to put the wreaths up on the hanging basket bracket. One or two of them had traces of that hairy odor. He had been snooping through the carport, touching things. If it had been skunked, everything would be noxious. The things that he touched were well off the ground. There was his lingering odor on one or two things, and on the door close to a closet. Because the items were in different locations, it tells me he was snooping around a little. He was feeling the wreaths. You could trace the lingering odor on them, but only one or two, not all of them. The odor was only on certain parts of the two wreaths, and there were 24 of them. Evidently, he was feeling the texture of the artificial greenery, touching it. That absolutely amazes me. He felt it to see if it was real, touching it. That reeks of intellect and an ability to explore something new. My neighbor was actually excited about it. I was completely freaked out, and my mom thinks it's exciting. She told me it proved that they were intelligent beings and not animals. This from my 85-year-old mother. I thought I caught a glimpse of a shadow a few times when I would look outside the door. In other words, when something is new in the carports, it looks around to check it out, like it's part of the neighborhood, like a nosy neighbor. I talked to a guy the other day who was telling me that he knows more people right around here who have had the same experience. It's like he just bops around the neighborhood at night, checking stuff out. He was telling me that one of his co-workers who lives near here sees one pretty constantly, and everyone in her family has seen it, and recently. Thanks. Signed, Sean. Dear TB, this happened in early August of 2010. You see, I spend most of the summers camping in and around the Adirondacks in my Dodge Caravan. This particular summer, I had stopped at Cascade Lake to spend a few days there camping. I had slept soundly the previous night, and I woke up around 7 a.m. I decided to get up and start making my breakfast. I had just started the kettle on the camp stove when I looked over at Upper Cascade Lake, and I could see the mist rising up off the surface. I grabbed my iPhone and walked about 50 yards to the edge of the lake to get a picture. As I approached the breakwall, I noticed a dark brown object on the opposite side of the lake at the shore. At first, I couldn't make out what I was looking at, but it seemed to be sitting at the water's edge. I then realized that it must be a bear. The animal looked like it was doing something in the water with its paws, as I could hear a faint splashing sound. I thought it would be a good idea to get a picture, so I brought my iPhone up to face level and tried to focus in on the animal. As I was focusing in, this animal, well, it just stood up on two legs. I was startled and pulled down my phone to see this with my own eyes. It took a step towards the tree line and stopped. And then, almost methodically, as it stopped, it turned its whole upper body to the left and just stared at me for a few seconds. It turned back and in one step just disappeared into the tree line. When it looked at me, I immediately went cold and got scared. As I ran back to my campsite, my only thought was that it was going to go either left or right. If it went right, it would have to go into the water. And if it went left, well, then it was headed directly for my campsite. I decided it was best to get the hell out of Dodge, so to speak. I arrived back at my campsite in just a few seconds. My dog was still asleep on the front seat and didn't stir at all. I yanked open the passenger side sliding door of my van and started to throw all the camping gear into the back, making quite a mess as I did. I slammed the door and then jumped into the driver's seat and floored the gas to leave. As I was leaving out, I kept looking out my left driver's side window to see if I could see it again, but I never did. I drove all the way into Lake Placid and parked at a mall parking lot to gather my thoughts and think about what had just taken place. I was pretty shaken up as I kept replaying the experience over and over in my head, just trying to make sense of what I'd seen. Thanks. Signed, Victor.
Quick narrator's note here. I emailed the witness back and wanted to know if he ever got that picture off and ask if he could provide any more details. He responded.
Hey biker, I got your email. And photo? No, I just couldn't. I'm not sure why when it stood up and stared at me, my mind just went completely blank other than run. It wasn't even like I could hear the word run in my head. It was just this overwhelming primal need to flee. It's really hard to describe. In details, well, I couldn't ascertain its height exactly because of the distance, but if I had to guess, it was probably 7 to 8 feet tall. And it was covered head to toe in shaggy, dark brown fur or hair. I could see the sunlight shining off its back as it turned to go into the tree line, and I could see the brown coloration as it turned away from me. When it turned to stare at me, I couldn't make out any facial features, but I knew that it saw me. The upper body was absolutely massive and stocky, like a football player's build. It had really long arms that went well below its waist. I could also make out what I assumed were the shape of its hands. It walked upright and paused before slowly turning its upper body to look directly at me. It stared at me for probably 5 to 10 seconds and then turned back to face the tree line. It took 1, maybe 2 steps before it had disappeared into the forest. I could see a few branches move after it went into the trees, and that was when I decided to leave. I never heard anything other than the initial splashing that it made in the water with its hands when I was thinking that it was a bear. I didn't return to that area until 3 years later with a friend to camp. Nothing has happened on subsequent trips to the area of Cascade Lake for me. I have 2 other odd experiences in other areas of the Adirondacks on other trips. Maybe I'll send those to you later on. Thanks again. Signed, Victor. Dear Biker, my grandfather, a World War II veteran and born in Scotland, came to Canada with my great-grandparents and lived by Elliott Lake from about 2 years of age until paranormal activity plagued him and his large family. Then, at about 11 years of age, they moved to the Golden Mile region of Ontario and Alliston. He, along with his 4 brothers and his father, used to pan for gold in the various rivers and streams there, near Elliott Lake, and that part in northern Ontario was known to be rich in other precious metals and gems, especially amethyst. That took them to Elliott Lake, in search of other stones, silver and gold, various other times while his family lived there. He recounted to me the first time of many paranormal experiences where he recalled an anomalous or paranormal encounter during a week-long camping, gold-panning excursion with his dad and 2 of his brothers and 1 of his sisters when he was about 9 years old, where they had been cooking fish caught by his sister over the campfire. He had little memory of any experiences that had preceded this one, although he had overheard much discussion. Anyhow, as they waited to eat his sister's catches, creepy screeching, howling, and then chattering sounds could be heard, almost as if close by, but emanating from somewhere within the forest that surrounded their campsite. He told me that they were sitting around on logs as their father was quite strict, and although the 3 boys were talking loudly, the creepy, unknown sounds quickly reduced the talk to nothing, and his dad, who had picked up his shotgun, had really instilled a deep sense of fear, to which they remained vigilantly silent and continued to listen in earnest. Due to the pending sense of danger that these sounds they had heard, coupled with their father having grabbed the shotgun, they continued to listen in complete silence. The only other sound came from the popping and crackling of the burning wood from the campfire. At first, what they heard was screeching, and the boys thought nothing of it, but later his older sister told him that she had asked their dad what it was. Once silence set in between the boys, it became obvious that this screeching sound didn't sound anything human. The growls and chatter, at first sounding like monkeys, were more guttural and quite frightening. There had been some talk of ape men, as they called them in the area during the 30s, but not many would talk about it openly, for fear of being labeled as delusional or crazy. Yet in whispers to one another, the boys speculated that these sounds were coming from an ape man. Then, after being hushed up again by their father, it sounded like the chatter was coming from 2 or more unknown creatures, and within a short time these sounds got closer to them. What truly frightened them was that the screeches or screams, as if an unknown creature was injured or in pain or trouble, and the theory later on was that this creature was calling for the help of one of its kind. The sounds came closer and closer, and the screeching slowly began to subside, and the chatter between these 2 or more creatures grew. Quietly but quickly, my grandfather's dad, after instructions to my great-aunt to go and hide, and the boys, they snuffed out the fire, buried the fish, and grabbing only necessary items to carry on their backs, abandoned camp, grabbing Grandpa's sister and hastily scrambled away from the approaching sounds. One of my brother's strings on his pack broke, and important tools were in his bag, so 2 of the brothers stopped to save what they could and place them in the other brother's bag. My grandpa and his sisters were in front of their father, who was in the middle and guarding the boys as they saved his gear. The 2 boys were, of course, behind him and somewhat still exposed to the opening of the trees and most near the lakefront where their now abandoned camp had stood. Suddenly, my great-grandfather yelled out, "Leave the gear and run," amongst other things that Grandpa said that he wouldn't repeat. My great-aunt screamed with distracted the 2 boys, who in turn, a fear-inducing howl, unlike anything any of them had ever heard before, came very loudly, very close. My great-grandfather yelled, "There's 4 or 5 of them, and God help us." My grandfather said that the two brothers left everything, and the group just ran, while their father fired shots at one of them. Because two ape men retreated, one was carrying a smaller one, but one was running at them, growling and shrieking aggressively. Fortunately, all 5 family members were unharmed and able to escape. To where, I don't think Grandpa ever said. They only ever discussed this encounter amongst themselves but a few times until many years had passed by. By the time my great-uncle George had brought it up with my grandpa and my great-uncle Gord, they'd all been married and started families of their own, scattering about different areas of Ontario. Grandpa believes it was 1949, before my mom and 2 of her older sisters were born, that he and Grandma had only 2 of their 5 children, but at the time what prompted the discussion was a Bigfoot Sasquatch story in Dawson's Creek, British Columbia, where my grandparents were about to move. From around the time of this Bigfoot sighting, around the 30s to the late 40s, many stories had been appearing in a lot of the newspapers, especially post-World War II. My grandfather became a closet Sasquatch researcher, amongst other areas of paranormal research, and he collected any article that he'd come across over those nearly 2 decades. Afterward, this open discussion about the experience that the brothers had. Grandpa shared the research with George and Gord, and Sasquatch had a name here in Canada. Throughout Grandpa's lifetime preceding his childhood experiences on Elliott Lake, after this discussion in 1949, Grandpa began to write stories for the newspapers in both the Ontario and British Columbia publications, most notably the Toronto Star. This wasn't his only paranormal experience, but it was one in which there was other witnesses. Grandpa had numerous paranormal experiences throughout his life, and Elliott Lake was the place where some of the more frightening but accepted experiences took place. He and his brother Gord saw UFOs there, but other anomalous creatures and entities were seen by him and others that he knew as a child. I believe that everything Grandpa ever shared with the people who read his newspaper stories was true. He didn't always mention that these stories were based on, if not 100% real-life true accounts, but he was well read. Unfortunately, back in the 50s and 60s, a published story only paid an average of about $200. His highest paid story published was in 1973, for which he was paid about $1,000, but it wasn't a paranormal story. It was a comedy called Mother Drives, a non-fiction account of him trying to teach Grandma, a 4'11" Scotswoman, how to drive a huge Cadillac boat, as she called it. In short, I have no idea where these Bigfoot cryptids come from, be it underground in caves or possibly interdimensional, but I too think that they're real. Also, there is some kind of tie-in with UFOs, and Elliott Lake is a popular destination for Bigfoot and Sasquatch hunters even to this day. His other paranormal experiences and publications are fascinating too. I've kept every original manuscript or writing that he's ever written, whether published or not. And one day, in honor of him and his unpublished work especially, I plan to put together a book full of his stories. Thanks, Biker, for reading this, and have a great weekend. God bless you, your family, and friends. Signed, Ken. Dear Tattooed Biker, thanks in advance for reading my email. I grew up in the country, in central Iowa, Marshall County to be exact, and where we lived, the houses were literally a mile apart. It was mostly farmland with large wooded areas in between. One particular summer, a schoolmate friend and I went camping at a local reservoir. I think we were maybe only 12 or 13 years old. Pre-high school, anyway. Now, this was back in the 70s, so I don't remember exactly, but what I do remember was that the campground that we stayed at was very isolated and around this huge reservoir. But there were park rangers around, so we never felt like the area was unsafe. But the very first night, around 2 in the morning, we heard someone walking around outside. We were both terrified because it was big, not like a raccoon or a possum. We were both frozen with fear. After about 10 minutes of not hearing anything, and assuming that whatever it was had already left, my friend got his flashlight and slowly unzipped the tent. He did this as quietly as humanly possible. When he turned on his flashlight, standing there was what we could only describe as a Bigfoot, just about 30 feet away from us, staring directly at us. It slowly backed up and walked away. We never heard anything else walking around that night after it left. We were so terrified and had no car, and they didn't have cell phones back then, so we just had to endure the rest of the night. When our parents finally picked us up the next day, we were so glad to get the heck out of there. And back then, we didn't know anything about Bigfoot. It wasn't even something that was talked about, at least not where we were. So at the time, we had no idea what we were looking at. Thanks for reading. Signed, Eric.
And there it is. Some of my favorite true encounter stories of ghosts, Bigfoot, Dogman, and various cryptid creatures from this past year. Thank you so much for taking this long ride with me. I really appreciate you. And if you have a strange encounter or an unexplained experience that you want to share, just send it to the email address in the description, and well, your story may just wind up in a future video. And now, as always, stay curious, stay vigilant, stay safe. I'll be seeing you on down the road a ways. Biker out.